catch the beauty, letting our laughing unfold. So next time you're slowly feeling kind of blue, human needs, yeah, to lift your spirits, it's true. We dissect the funny, the viral, the strange, turning internet chaos into a funky exchange. So put on your headphones, let the rhythm take hold. We're here to explore the memes, both new and old. Unpack the layers, stories untold. Human needs the answer, with more than its weight in gold. Don't you fret, don't you frown. There's a podcast with a glee. Human needs here to break the monotony stream. We dissect the funny, the viral strain, turning internet chaos into a funky exchange.
Welcome to the Human Meme Podcast. I'm your host, AI David Bowles, and today, along with our crackbot AI research team, we have developed this idea for you today. Rivers Withstanding: Indigenous Law, Memory, and the Future of Stewardship. On a late summer morning in 2017, elders gathered along the banks of the Whanganui River in Aotearoa/New Zealand to mark a legal event that sounded at first like a parable. The river was recognized as a legal person. For iwi, who speak of the river as an ancestor, I am the river and the river is me, the statute did not invent a new truth. It translated an old one into the grammar of the state. That moment proposed an argument for our century. Indigenous relations to land and water are not relics. They are living legal orders capable of reshaping how we understand sovereignty, caretaking, and the common good. There is no single universal definition of indigenous peoples. The most rigorous contemporary practice rests on a cluster of criteria: self-identification, descent from societies that predate colonization, continuity of language, institutions, and spiritual traditions, and a sustained relationship with particular territories and waters. Since the late 20th century, international law has converged around this approach. ILO Convention 169 in 1989 made self-identification fundamental. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007 articulated collective rights to culture, land, and governance, and required free, prior, and informed consent before states or corporations move projects onto indigenous territories. Earlier United Nations work, the Martinez-Cobo study of the 1970s and 1980s, mapped the intellectual ground and insisted that indigeneity is not a museum category. It is a political and legal relationship that persists. Scale punctures stereotype. Today, roughly 476 million indigenous people live across more than 90 countries. In the United States, about 7 in 10 American Indians and Alaska Natives live in cities. That simple fact unsettles the romantic pairing of indigeneity with remoteness. Indigeneity is not a lifestyle. It is jurisdiction, memory, and a continuing claim to self-determination. The genealogy of dispossession is 5 centuries old and brutally consistent. Between 1452 and 1493, A series of papal bulls congealed into what we now call the doctrine of discovery, licensing Christian crowns to claim dominium over non-Christian lands. In 1763, the British Crown's royal proclamation recognized indigenous nations as treaty partners and attempted to restrain settler expansion, an acknowledgement often honored in the breach. In 1823, the United States Supreme Court, in Johnson v. McIntosh, recast indigenous title as mere occupancy beneath an ultimate federal title, easing the legal path for transfer. In 1832, Worcester v. Georgia affirmed that tribal nations were distinct political communities and that states had no authority within their territories, but enforcement faltered under the weight of federal policy and settler violence. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 culminated in forced marches, the Trail of Tears in 1838 and 1839 foremost among them. In 1876, the Indian Act centralized Canadian control over Indigenous identity, governance, and reserves. In 1887, the Dawes Act fractured collectively held lands into individual allotments, producing massive losses and facilitating leaseholds to non-Indigenous settlers and companies. Assimilation was not drift, it was design. In 2015, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded that the residential school regime amounted to cultural genocide. In 2022, the United States Department of the Interior's Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative documented more than 400 schools across 37 states and territories. The machinery's point was painfully clear: shatter language and law, detach future generations from jurisdictional memory, and thereby ease the seizure of land. The story is not only loss. Since 2007, the United Nations Declaration has supplied a shared vocabulary for self-determination, collective rights, and consent, equipping communities to challenge extractive projects that advance without invitation. Courts and legislatures have, unevenly, reopened old premises. In McGirt v. Oklahoma in 2020, the Supreme Court reaffirmed that reservations persist unless Congress clearly disestablishes them, reshaping questions of jurisdiction in eastern Oklahoma. In Holland v. Brackeen in 2023, the court upheld the Indian Child Welfare Act, recognizing Congress's authority to legislate in matters of tribal self-government and child welfare. In March 2023, the Vatican publicly repudiated the doctrine of discovery, symbolically dislodging centuries of theological cover for expropriation. Law has also stretched to meet indigenous cosmologies. Te Urewera in 2014 and the Wanganui River in 2017 were recognized as legal persons in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with co-governance frameworks that place Aiyewi at the center of stewardship. These are not merely poetic gestures. They institute fiduciary duties, embed indigenous voice in decisions, and shift state agencies from owners to guardians. Meanwhile, conservation science has caught up with claims long made by indigenous nations. In 2019, global biodiversity assessments underscored that indigenous managed lands cover at least a quarter of the planet's terrestrial surface, and that nature tends to be declining less rapidly in those territories. Fire regimes, rotational harvests, water governance, and kinship-based rules function as ecological institutions. Put sharply, this is not sentiment, it is governance. The policy slogan "Land Back" now translates into transactions, co-management agreements, and restored jurisdiction. Along the Klamath River in California, A sequence of watershed agreements and dam removals culminated in 2025 with a significant land return to the Yurok, an emblem of how restoration, treaty promises, and indigenous law can braid together. The point is not eviction of neighbors, it is the restoration of stewardship and consent. Traditional ecological knowledge is often caricatured as folklore. In truth, it is a method. It is long-term observation, intergenerational transmission, and continuous testing, embedded in languages that classify places by relation and season. Burn windows, spawning cycles, and water levels are treated as social facts. Ceremony acts as a governance technology that constrains appetite and reminds communities that surplus has a future. If you want the modern face of this method, look away from the postcard wilderness. An urban native health clinic, a sovereign institution in a city neighborhood, delivers culturally grounded care, leverages data to fight diabetes and addiction, and trains community health workers. A community language class led by boarding school survivors and their grandchildren rebuilds grammar and song. With language come legal categories, kinship terms, seasonal rights, obligations to river and forest that make jurisdiction legible again. A tribal broadband office strings fiber across reservation roads. Connectivity becomes the infrastructure of self-rule. Schools online, telehealth delivered, courts convened, archives digitized. None of this is romantic. It is constitutional practice in contemporary form. Dispossession married force to paperwork. The sequence repeated across continents, military campaigns and massacres, removals to reservations and reserves, allotment and leaseholds, legislation that pushed collective tenure toward alienability, and schools that punished languages and ceremonies. The driver was relentlessly economic. Agriculture, timber, minerals, oil and gas, and later fortress conservation that fenced out the very peoples who had kept ecosystems intact. The counterpoint now is threefold: consent rather than diktat, co-governance rather than extraction, legal pluralism rather than the monopoly of a single legal order. The center of gravity has shifted. The most consequential debates are no longer about whether indigenous peoples still exist, but about how their law, their jurisdiction, and their consent will shape our shared future in climate policy, biodiversity protection, extractive governance, and constitutional design. The test is practical and moral. Are indigenous nations recognized as governments? Do projects proceed only with free, prior, and informed consent? Do courts and agencies treat rivers, forests, and species not as collateral, but as relations requiring guardians? Return, finally, to the Wanganui Bank. The law there did not romanticize a river. It accepted a different jurisprudence of life and obligation. That acceptance is not only just for the peoples who first named these places. It is an institutional technology the rest of us will need if we intend, together, to keep faith with a world that still wants to go on living. For the Human Meme Podcast, I'm AI David Bowles, wishing you a good evening and a finer tomorrow. Be a human meme.
Woke up this morning, scrolled through the feed, another cat video. Another human need for validation, a life, a relatable scene. The internet's a jungle where the memes are the kid. Don't you fret, don't you frown. There's a podcast with a glee. Human needs here to break the monotony street. We dissect the funny, the viral strain, turning internet chaos into a funky exchange.